Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly historical discussions, our history chats, if you will. Thanks for joining me again. I'm Rob Goller. And this week's topic actually came out of a conversation I was having with somebody about the Iowa caucuses, which we had this week. If you're watching this live, we had them yesterday. Iowa Republicans went to what they called caucuses, and they were to select their delegates for the presidential election. And it gets a lot of attention, of course, because it's the first caucus or primary, and so whoever wins ends up with every 4 years we hear they get the momentum going into other primaries and caucuses. Um, and so on the news, they get a lot of attention. And even though that attention might be um, from a statistical standpoint, probably a little overblown because if you actually look at the numbers, less than 100,000 Republicans voted in the Iowa caucuses, so less than 100,000 people, the population of a couple towns here in Western New York, is deciding the winner of the first primary slash caucus to determine delegates. So, so they get an outweighed influence, in my opinion, on the process. However, a lot of attention was drawn to the word caucus. It's an interesting word, and it's also every 4 years we hear on the news the need for the reporters to explain what a caucus is. And it seems like a foreign concept to many folks because here in New York State we don't caucus. We select, we vote for presidential electors or presidential, delegates for the parties by primary. And we also do that with our local elections. So each party gets a candidate, and if there's a competition between two Republicans, two Democrats for a position, it'll go to a primary where members of that party actually go to the polls, and you actually vote, and the Board of Elections runs the primary election, and you select the party's candidate through a primary. A caucus is, and they explain this on the news for people like us in New York State who may not be familiar with how it works, is everyone shows up at a meeting, either at a school or a town hall, a meeting hall, and they all show up at the same time. And in Iowa's case, it was 7 p.m. on Monday evening, and they vote there in a ballot box in these small precincts, and it's a meeting. You don't go all day and vote at a polling place. Uh, um, and the difference here in New York State, for instance, here in East Aurora, when you vote in a primary, it's held just like an election. There is, by law, no campaigning within 100 feet of the polling station. Caucuses, they actually encourage the debate, and they actually have people stand up and talk about their particular candidates, why they support those candidates, push the candidates, positions, and why you should vote for them. So that's different. There is campaigning at a caucus, whereas in a primary election there isn't. So we in New York State are not used to a caucus. But as I was talking to somebody about that, as to us not doing that, and we're not familiar in New York State with that, is we did do caucuses for quite a bit of our history, and it's interesting to look back. Going back to the 1800s, there were, before 1901, actually, town elections, so the town of Aurora elections, were held in March. And they were held at what was called a town meeting. And elections were traditionally held in March, and I've talked about this before. They held them in March because it was late enough, so after most of the snow and bad weather had happened, and so spring was starting to arrive, but before the crops had to go in. And remember, men were doing the voting, so a lot of them had to travel long distances because the towns were bigger. So they wanted to make sure that the people could get to the polls, and it actually worked out. One of the first town meetings in Western New York was held up in Newstead, and the town was huge by today's standards. And the men of this town went up to what is today Newstead, and most of them made it and voted for their town supervisor. out in the street, and they had both candidates stand in the middle of the road, and the candidate you supported you stood behind, and whoever had the longest line was elected the supervisor of the town. So it was a town meeting. So you didn't go to the polls all day. It wasn't like 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. You arrived for the town meeting. This happened even when the towns got smaller and smaller, and even when Aurora, which is the town we're in, but any town in New York State at that time, in our region, you would have gone to a town meeting, not to the polls. So each party, and back in the 1800s, there were different parties, but the late 1800s, you had the Republicans and Democrats had formed after the Civil War. And then you had third parties, like Prohibition was a big one, and there was a progressive party. But they would caucus, and you could go to a meeting, and they actually put it in the newspaper. And you would, if you were aligned with that party, you would go and you would select a slate of candidates, a ticket to go to the town meeting. And so the week before the town meeting, which was held in early March, the newspaper would list the slate of candidates, and you would go to the town meeting, and a lot of times it was held at the West End Fire Hall here in the village, but all the men would come to this meeting, and they would call the meeting to order, and they were, in addition to electing your town representatives, your town supervisor, your town board members, your town justices of the peace, superintendent of the poor. There were a lot of positions that don't exist anymore. They would have reports, and they would call the meeting, probably at noon or 1. That seemed to be the time they would do it. And they would give the reports, the financial reports, and any other highway report. And then they would vote on things. They would vote on spending money on major projects, capital projects. They would be voted upon by the people at the town meeting. And then one of the most important things they voted on at the end of the meeting was where to hold the next town meeting. And that was pretty controversial because folks in West Falls and the more rural areas didn't always want to come into East Aurora. Remember, it was harder than it is today to drive into town. So they would sometimes try to have the meeting held in their neck of the woods. Didn't always work out. So it generally was held because the population center was here in the village. They would vote to have the next year's election here in the village. And they had annual elections. Some positions were 2 years, and some were annual, and they would just vote on these positions. There would be a secret ballot. However, you would have tickets, and that's why they call them tickets today. If you wanted to vote for all the Republicans or all the Democrats or all the Prohibition candidates, you would just grab the ticket that had all their names listed on it and put it in the ballot box. And if you wanted to vote for someone who vote for one person, a Democrat for one position, a Republican another, you could do that, and they called that splitting the ticket, and that makes sense because you would literally split the ticket and put a ticket who you wanted in from one party and another party, so you were splitting the ticket. But in most cases, people in most elections would support a party and put the names in. However, there were some newspaper articles that noted that people did split tickets quite a bit, and that resulted in some interesting results of elections back then. But the town meeting was sort of a caucus where people would meet at a meeting and all vote at the same time. It wasn't all day, and certainly not early voting like we have today. You didn't have weekends, a couple weekends before election day to vote. And primaries didn't exist. So the parties would get together in a meeting, a caucus, and they used that word in the newspaper. So that word might be foreign to us today, but caucusing was just what you did back in the 1800s. And each party the members of that party, not just a committee, would select their slate of candidates, and they would put them forth at the town meeting. So in both cases, the party level, and then when you got to the town meeting, it was more of a caucus, a meeting, rather than the process that we have today, where you go to a primary. It used to be held in September for local positions. Now it's held in June. And it was definitely a different way of voting and electing our local officials than it is today. One of the interesting things is, and we talked about today, the rules are you can't politic or campaign within 100 feet of a polling station. But those caucus meetings, the town meetings, they encouraged debate. And of course, there would have to be rules, but they encouraged the debate. You were allowed to campaign, and they would do that during the town meeting. Each of the parties would go into their corners, and there would be a lot of wheeling and dealing going around to try and encourage people to vote for your candidate. And they would debate the candidates right there. So it was a much different atmosphere. Now remember, only men could vote back then, before 1917, in New York State. So there was actually one of the big things that they voted on at the annual town meeting was whether to be a wet town or a dry town, whether to allow the sale of alcohol or not allow this, to prohibit alcohol. And this could change from one year to the next. And there were very strong forces lobbying on both sides. One of them being the tavern owners, of course, they want to sell their alcohol. And then they mentioned, even though women couldn't vote, they mentioned in some of the local newspaper coverage of these town meetings that groups of ladies showed up at the meeting, and they were handing out flyers encouraging the men to vote against drinking, to make it a dry town. There were a lot of women's groups, women's temperance groups, women's Christian organizations and unions that were against the sale of alcohol, and they would go and lobby at the town meeting, which I found interesting because today, when you go to vote, it's not, there isn't any campaigning happening at the polling station, perhaps outside, but not at the actual meeting. So I found that interesting. So in the 1800s, that's how it worked at the town meeting. Well, in 1901, they changed how we vote. And so they moved the town elections to the November general election, and it became part of that process. And so the town meeting went away, and you actually went to the polls, and shortly thereafter they bought voting machines. Each town purchased voting machines, and you went in, and for so many hours the polls were open, and you voted, and then they tabulate, like they do today, tabulate the votes at the end. But it wasn't a town meeting where everybody gathered at the same time. So an election versus a caucus. So our early town meetings were more caucus than they were an election or going to the polls. And they actually did have caucuses for the parties, which today we don't really do. Some towns do. When I worked in Rochester, when I was a newspaper reporter, and I was covering a local town, and they called the Republican caucus, and it was such a foreign idea for me because we don't have that around here. And I went to the Republican caucus, and all the Republicans who wanted to attend, registered Republicans, instead of going to the polls and selecting their candidates, they went to the caucus and they voted there in a ballot box, and they were counted up, and the party actually runs the caucus. And that's how they selected their nominee for the town elections. And then if you had three candidates and one candidate, you didn't have a candidate get 50% or more votes, there would be some jockeying back and forth, and the person who got the least amount of votes would drop out of the race, and then they might endorse one of the other candidates. So there was a lot more back and forth and debate at the caucus than there would be at the primary election. So that does still happen, but we just don't do that here in East Aurora. And so it's a foreign concept. That word, that topic, that concept of electing officials through a caucus is a little different. Village elections here in the village of East Aurora. Now, the village is a incorporated government within the town. So if you live in the village, you are also a town taxpayer, but the village is incorporated within it to provide certain services. This goes back to the 1800s. I've talked about that before. But the village has elections as well for mayor and village trustee. Well, today, traditionally, a lot of villages do have Democrats and Republicans, and the parties actually nominate candidates. But here in the village of East Aurora, traditionally, we have not had the major parties. But you'll notice, when you do go to vote, they do have parties listed next to the candidates. And most of the candidates today will come up with their own party and their own party logo. But back in probably before the 1950s, you would read in the newspaper there would be slates of candidates put forth, and groups of businessmen and businesswomen would get together, civic groups would get together, and they would come up with slates of candidates. Taxpayer first, back when electric was a big deal, or sanitation, or putting in telephone utilities. They would have groups of folks who would push a certain agenda, or a set of agendas, and they would come up with a third party, but there would be no major parties. And you would have a slate of candidates for the Village Progress Party, things like that. And I'm just making that up, but there were actual names of parties. And so they would caucus, and they would actually use that word in the newspaper of the Village First Party, or the We Need Electric the Electric Party. There was actually a party, I believe, named the Electric Party, would meet. They would want electricity in the village, and they would meet, and they would caucus, and then they would put forth a slate of candidates for the village election. So today we're not used to, other than reading or watching TV about the Iowa caucuses, we're not used to in our area having a caucus as a way to pick our political candidates. But we did, and it was part of a very important part of our history. Not only the caucus, the meeting, or the town meeting, where decisions were made. What I find interesting is we switched over to the voting for our town officials in 1901. Got rid of the town meeting format, but there are places, very well known, in Vermont, Massachusetts, the towns where they have the annual town meeting, and it's just like we did back in the 1800s here, where they would literally close schools, close businesses, and it's town meeting day. If you go on to any college, I was on a small town college's website doing some research, and in March they have the campus is closed for town meeting day, and I'm like, what does that mean? And you go on and you read that their town, the town that college is in, most of them meet on the same day throughout Vermont and Massachusetts, and there's some other places, and they have a moderator who's elected, and they moderate the meeting, and they vote on essentially everything, and there's a board of selectmen for the rest of the year who decide. But so they go to a meeting where everybody shows up at the same time in the same place. And during COVID, they got creative with Zoom, and they vote on their town officials. They vote on major expenditures for things, big projects. It's a more of a democracy than a republic form, a representative republic. It's just a different way of doing it. To us, I was talking to somebody who came from Vermont recently, and they were talking about the town meeting, and to us, it's a foreign concept, the idea that once a year everybody would get together at a town meeting. But in the late 1800s, here in our own community, it wasn't a foreign concept. That's how they did it. A meeting rather than going to the polls throughout the day or over the course of several weekends to select your representatives. So we have caucused in the past here in our community. So thanks again for these great ideas. Appreciate you inquiring about local history. Again, I am Rob Goller, the Town and Village Historian. But these videos I do are separate from my official duties as Town and Village Historian. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or send me a private message. Either one works. And again, if you like what you hear, feel free to like this page, follow this page, and these videos are also available on the YouTube channel under Robert Lowell Goller, and feel free to subscribe to those pages as well. Thanks again. Bring the ideas on, and thanks for keeping history alive. We'll see you next time.